afternoon. I'm Laura for Stand Up Minnesota, and this is our series of Facebook Live town halls with candidates for the DFL nomination in next month's primary. Today we are joined by Tina Smith, United States Senator. Born in New Mexico, Tina came to Minnesota 34 years ago to work for General Mills and start her family. She later became a leader of Planned Parenthood and worked to expand access to health care for women. She was Chief of Staff to Minneapolis Mayor R.T. Rybak, then was elected Lieutenant Governor in 2014. In that role, she worked to strengthen Minnesota's economy and employment rate and to close the racial wealth gap. For the next 45 minutes, Tina will be taking your questions. Just type your question into the feed. We'll get to as many as we can. Please welcome Tina Smith. Thank you, Tina, for being here.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to just do a giant shout out to Stand Up Minnesota for your activism and the work that you're doing in your communities all across this state to be engaged. I want to say from the get-go that I know a lot of us right after the election in 2016 just didn't quite know what to do with ourselves. And I will never forget being at the march in St. Paul that the day after the inauguration in 2017 and seeing, what was it, like 100,000 people, women and men, young people, old people, all show up and say, wait a minute, these are our voices. This is how we're going to use our voices to talk about the future of our country and what kind of country we want it to be. And that, to me, is what inspires me, and it's why I really wanted to be here with you today. I want to say just one thing also, which is it wasn't in my bio, but it's sort of why I'm here. When I first moved to Minnesota, we lived in St. Louis Park. Archie and I lived in St. Louis Park. We had two little kids, and they were maybe, 2 and 1 or 3 and 1 when I got involved in my first political campaign. And I just showed up to volunteer, to get people out to vote for a state legislative race. And my job was to organize the apartment buildings. Everybody said, don't bother with the apartment buildings. Those people won't vote. They don't really, they're renters, they're young, they're not going to be engaged. And we said, forget about that. We're going to go and talk to them. And we did, and we won that race because of that kind of organizing. To me, that is what this is all about. It is what inspires me. I'm an activist at heart, and that's why I'm so happy to be able to be here and talk with you guys today.
Great. Awesome. All right, we're going to have our first question coming up in just a minute here. All right, so your first question is from Chris. So Chris asks, what can Democrats do to reverse the damage Trump's judges are doing to our legal system? Looks like, here we go. Would impeachment of judges and increasing the size of the Supreme Court be on the table in a Democrat-controlled Senate?
Well, I think it's so smart, Chris, to be asking this question about the Supreme Court. A lot of people have a hard time remembering or understanding the impact of the Supreme Court on our daily lives, but it is the Supreme Court that decides, who we can marry, what kind of rights we have at work, what kind of rights women have in the doctor's offices. I mean, is the Supreme Court going to be looking over the shoulder of our doctors, telling us what we are able to do with our own bodies? I mean, it is just extremely important. Right now, we have a real challenge, right? Because of the way the rules have been changed in the Senate, we don't have the ability to filibuster on these judicial nominations like we used to. But we have to all stand up and fight against these nominations, especially Brett Kavanaugh, who is before the Senate. I have already come out being opposed to Brett Kavanaugh. I'd like to point out that my opponent in the general election, Karen Housley, has said that she thinks that Brett Kavanaugh is exactly the right kind of judge to have. So we are dramatically different there. I am, I think we all should talk, and I'd like to know what everybody else thinks about this idea of whether or not we should be impeaching judges. I think that I feel so strongly that the judicial branch needs to be a fully independent and nonpartisan branch of government. And of course, during the Roosevelt administration, we did have more Supreme Court judges, and now it's back down to 9. So it's not as if that's never been thought of before. I'm not taking a position on that right now, but I'm certainly aware that we've looked at that before in our country.
Related question from Nicole. Nicole says, Senator, please update us on what can be done to prevent Kavanaugh from being confirmed to the Supreme Court.
Yes. Well, what can be done is that we all have to mobilize and we all have to make our voices heard. And I want to remind everybody, I mean, let's be honest, it is an uphill battle stopping this nomination. But remember, it was not quite just about a year ago that the Trump White House and the Republicans in the Senate were saying that they wanted to repeal the Affordable Care Act. This is a legislation which has allowed us to expand health insurance for millions and millions of people. And everybody said, oh, we're going to lose that battle because the Republicans are in charge. But after a massive upswelling of people's votes and people's voices in the Senate, we were able to defeat that Affordable Care Act repeal by one vote. So I think it's important for all of us to be thinking about who we can reach out to, who we can talk to. Think about the people that you know that live in other states. Think about the voice, the way that you can make your voice be heard. And meanwhile, in the Senate, we will be asking tough questions. We need to get to the bottom of what Judge Kavanaugh's position is on, for example, executive privilege. He seems to believe, he's written and spoken clearly, that he thinks that the president should not be exposed to any investigations while he's president. Just this weekend, he said that he felt that the U.S. versus Nixon case, which held President Nixon accountable, might have been decided wrongly. Those are the kind of questions that I know my colleagues on the Judiciary Committee and in the Senate as a whole are going to be asking.
Your Republican opponent is already using your time at Planned Parenthood as a negative. Can you let us know how you will handle her criticism on the campaign trail?
Well, my Republican opponent is using Planned Parenthood as a negative because she is anti-choice. She believes that Roe versus Wade should be overturned. She is in favor of putting all sorts of restrictions and hurdles in the way of women exercising their freedom to decide for themselves their reproductive lives. And I am not the least bit ashamed of my work at Planned Parenthood. To the contrary, I'm proud of that work and I talk about it all the time. And what I say is that over 2 million women and men every year go to Planned Parenthood for trusted reproductive health care, including cancer screenings, contraception, testing and treatment for sexually transmitted infections, and for abortion services. Women trust Planned Parenthood, and I'm proud to have been a part of their work. I'm proud to have stood with the volunteers and the healthcare providers that work at Planned Parenthood, and I will continue to do that.
Can you just give our audience, if they're not familiar with what you did at Planned Parenthood, like what was your role in the organization?
Yeah.
Just
Thank
briefly.
you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I started out as a board member for Planned Parenthood. My dad was on the board of Planned Parenthood in Ohio when he was, several years ago, which is really cool. So I knew what an important organization it was. My mom taught me that. So I ended up being a volunteer. I was on the board. I became the board chair and did a lot of work to help advance Planned Parenthood's mission. And then I went to go work for Planned Parenthood, where I was responsible for all of the education, all of the marketing and communications to help make sure that women and men knew about the services that Planned Parenthood offered. And then I did a lot of advocacy work for Planned Parenthood at the state legislature. And one of the things I'm really proud of that we did was our teen council work, which I oversaw when I was at Planned Parenthood, which was about teaching and working with teens to become peer educators and peer counselors in their schools. And that program still exists, and it is a very, very important way that kids learn not only how to be advocates for themselves, but how to do organizing.
Thank you. Natalie has a question. She asks, how will you address issues affecting persons of color? Will you commit to hiring them in your office? Natalie says, while she interned on the Hill, she noticed that it was not diverse at all, to put it bluntly, and would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Natalie, this is a really, really important issue, and it's gotten a lot of attention, correctly so, in the Senate, which is not at all a diverse place. And we have made this a real priority in my Senate office. Not everybody may know this, but when I joined the Senate and took the seat that had previously been held by Senator Franken, of course. What I did is I hired many of the people that had worked on Senator Franken's team. This was really important because it allowed me to hit the ground running and be as effective and efficient as I could be right out of the bat. And that's a fantastic team of people and it's also a diverse group of people, and I'm working really hard to continue that and also to build it. The thing is, I'm just going to say, one of the excuses that you hear a lot of times when people talk about their staffs is they'll say, well, I'd like to hire more diverse people, but it's really hard to find people of color to serve in these roles. I hear that all the time, and I think that is such an excuse. And what you have to do, what I do all the time, is I'm constantly building up our networks, finding new ways of reaching out, and not expecting people to come to me, but going to the communities that I want to be representing, and then looking for people to bring in to be a part of this work that we're all doing together.
Chuck asks, what about expanding the court to 11 justices when we have a Democratic president in 2021? Yeah, then go Chuck. Would you support that?
I don't have a position on that, and I don't mean to sound like I'm copping out on this. I really am. I'd be willing to take a look at it, but I'm really focused right now on making sure that the nominee that we have is it gets appropriately vetted and secured. And I will say I worry about this question because right now, how can I put this? The Supreme Court is becoming increasingly politicized, and I don't want to do anything that contributes to that politicalization of the Supreme Court. And I worry about what might happen if the other side was in charge of everything, what they might do to stack the courts.
Jesse asks, what will be done to restore net neutrality? Is this only a temporary policy that cannot be written into law?
Yeah. Net neutrality means that we should have a free and open internet, and that big companies that live hundreds of miles away don't get to decide what information that you can get and how much you have to pay for it, or how fast it is for one train of information versus the other. And it is just so important. Now, the FCC is making decisions about net neutrality. We've worked really hard I don't understand why the Republicans are, why they don't see that this is in everybody's best interest. It's really good for small businesses, net neutrality. I've talked to small businesses in Minnesota who said, I can't compete against the big companies if I have to worry about whether Amazon is going to be on a fast track and I'm going to be put on a slow track because of because I'm just the little person. So net neutrality is really, really important, and we're fighting for net neutrality. The Democrats, again, are fighting for net neutrality in the Senate, and the Republicans are not.
Chris asks, why have you not signed on as a co-sponsor of Bernie's Medicare for All bill?
That's a great question. First of all, I want to be very clear that I think that healthcare is a human right, and that you should never have to choose between paying for your healthcare and paying rent or buying groceries. I believe that the best, most direct way of getting to that is through a single payer system. I support single payer. Now, in the short time that I've been in the Senate, I have signed on to a whole group of legislation that will move us down that path, including a Medicare opt-in, including legislation that helps to lower the cost of prescription drugs. And I am still looking at Bernie's bill. I think that it is I very much support the goals of the bill, and as I said, I believe that single payer is the way to go. I'm just looking at it to make sure I understand what the impacts would it be, kind of what that transition would look like and how that would work in Minnesota. Because ultimately, I need to be responsible for voting for the things and supporting the things and advancing the things that are going to be good for Minnesota. But I do believe in single payer.
Apologies. I got cut off. There we go. Oh, follow up. Okay. Even with the Affordable Care Act, there are still many people who can't afford coverage, and I know people personally who fall into this category. What solution do you support to provide affordable health care for all, and what is the process to get there? Now, you said you support single payer, so tell us a little bit about what that would look like in reality.
Right. Well, I want to say that wherever I go in Minnesota, and I've traveled to every corner of the state, the number one thing that people talk to me about is the cost of health care. And the very first bill that I introduced was a bill to fix this loophole. It has to do with drug costs. Drug costs are just rapidly rising. I believe that the drug market is anti-competitive, And drug companies are allowed to basically charge whatever the market will bear, and even more than the market will bear. So the very first bill that I introduced is a bill that would fix a loophole that allows the big drug companies to pay to keep lower cost generic drugs off the market. I think that's just wrong. Big drug companies have all the money they need. I also support the idea of giving people the option of buying in to Medicare. You know, roughly half of the people who have health insurance in this country right now have health insurance through some public program, either Medicare or Medicaid or the VA. And when I was lieutenant governor, I supported an option to opt into Minnesota Care. And it would have been a much more efficient way of expanding health insurance to people around the country, around the state, than what we have right now. I also think that we should not remember what the Trump administration wants to do. The Trump administration wants to, they basically say, we can't defend this idea of the Affordable Care Act, especially when it comes to forcing insurance companies to cover you even if you have a pre-existing condition. Well, what that means is that if I'm sick, and if I've got diabetes, or maybe I had breast cancer, an insurance company could say, "Oh, sorry, we're not going to cover you." I think those kinds of insurance, those junk insurance plans and bans on pre-existing conditions, I don't think that we should have those at all. And I really believe that we need to get more transparency in the prescription drug market, so that we actually can see why are the prices being set the way they're being set. I have introduced a bill that would require the big drug companies to tell us what they did with their giant windfall tax breaks that they got from the big tax cut bill that I wasn't there when it passed. I wouldn't have supported it. We need to be able to, more transparency, we need more options for people, and we need to be moving towards a path towards single payer.
Jordan says many have expressed concerns about copper sulfide mining near the BWCA. This comes up a lot on Stand Up Minnesota. How will you guarantee protection of the BWCA before any mine opens, instead of just requiring a fund to, quote, clean up the mess?
Well, first I want to say about the Boundary Waters, I think so many of us in Minnesota and really all around the country we love the Boundary Waters. It's personal for so many of us. It certainly is that way for my family. I will never support a project that is going to do damage to the Boundary Waters. I think that it is just absolutely essential. So you can't just say, oh well, we'll clean it up if it is if pollution happens. You have to make sure that that the Boundary Waters are protected, and I will always do that.
Okay.
The permitting process for the Boundary Water, the permitting process for mining in Minnesota is primarily a state issue. It's handled through the Department of Natural Resources and the PCA, but the Boundary Waters is different because there could be, because it's this national treasure. There's one other thing I wanted to say about this.
It was specifically about the copper sulfide mining, so I don't know if you want to dig in.
Yeah.
I'm not as familiar with that project, but we have people in our group who they're very, very passionate about this. And so if you can. Well,
so for example, there is a proposed mine that is called the Twin Metals mine that would be a mine to a copper nickel mine, a copper mine that would be, I think, within less than half a mile of the Boundary Waters and be in the Boundary Waters watershed. And so that, I think, is maybe what our questioner is asking about. And I want to just reiterate that I will never support a project that is going to do damage to the Boundary Waters.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Follow up, what was your process to decide between the concerns of Democrats statewide versus the concerns of the Iron Range? Do you even see it that way? I guess this could be a reframing of that question. I think
that let me see if I can answer that question fully. I think that here's what I stand for. I stand for doing everything we can to protect our air and our water resources, to protect our land, to protect endangered species. That is the heart of Minnesota, and it's really kind of the heart of how I initially first got involved in politics and campaigning. And I think that sometimes there's this, what I consider to be a false choice that is set up between, oh, you either are for the environment or you are for jobs and economic development. And our mission, our job, I think, is to try to figure out how to bridge that. I think that's really, really important. The questioner may be asking about the question of the Polymet mine, which I'll just make that think maybe that's what you're asking about.
That's one of the ones that comes up.
Yeah.
So
maybe I can just answer that question. Okay. So the Polymet mine is completely different from the mine that would be in the Boundary Waters watershed. It's a completely different mine. It is a proposal that would be a copper mine that would be on an old taconite ferrous mining site on the Iron Range. That site is currently a polluted site, and the question is, should that mine be allowed to go forward? And there's been a lot of discussion about this. So the first thing I want to just clarify for everybody is that's a completely different project from any project that affects the Boundary Waters at all. This Polymet mine has been going through an extensive environmental review process that is all managed by the state. It's been happening for upwards of 10 years. And what I've said about this is that if that mine completes that environmental process, and according to the environmental review, it meets all of the requirements of that environmental review, then it will go forward. And I wouldn't stand in the way of it. Two things about that environmental review that are important to know. One is that it would be the first time, to my knowledge, that there would be this significant financial, it's called the financial assurance package. And what it is it would say the company would basically give control to the state over the resources that would be required to restore the landscape and do water treatment, do the water treatment that could be required in perpetuity. Usually what happens is the company keeps control of that money. And so if that company goes out of business or it gets sold, then that becomes a liability that you lose. That wouldn't be the case if this, according to the way this permitting is being done. And then the second thing that is, I think, interesting about this is that the water quality requirements that could be placed on this, or would be placed on this if the permitting continues to completion, would actually improve the water quality in that area, because, as I said, there's already been some damage to water quality from the old ferrous mine. So those are all of the reasons that I think that this is a project that if it passes through all that environmental review, that it would go forward.
Carrie asks, how will you protect every pregnant Minnesotan's right to abortion in light of the attacks at the federal level?
When I was 16 years old when Roe versus Wade was decided, the fundamental right of women to control their own reproductive lives, to make decisions for themselves about when and how and with whom they want to start a family, is fundamental. It's fundamental to our personal freedom, and it's also fundamental to our economic security, right? If you can't control your own reproductive life, you really can't control anything about your life. The idea that the president has promised that he was going to nominate to the Supreme Court a person who would overturn Roe versus Wade is just anathema to me. And it is why I very, very quickly came out in opposition to this nominee. So I will do everything that is in my power in the Senate to push back against this, to fight for judges that respect established law like Roe versus Wade. I will talk to my colleagues in the Senate. I will do everything. I will work hard to build a base and a support for that in the Senate. But we all need to do that. We all, there's not just
my next question.
We all need to do that. Well, you can certainly tell me what you think, though. If you're thinking what I'm thinking, you should know that I'm with you. You could reach out to other members of Congress. You should think about the people that you know in other states around the country. Think about who you know in Maine and Alaska and in all over the country, and reach out. And then the most important thing is to vote. Vote on on August 14th and then vote again in the general election in November. And remember that in November, my Republican opponent is a person who is not pro-choice, who has a lifelong record of in public life of standing up against women's right to have their own reproductive choices. So that's a stark choice.
Mm-hmm. Melissa says if you win, you'll be up for election again in just 2 years. What do you plan, what is your plan to gain the confidence of Minnesotans over that period of time?
Yeah. It is really unusual. That's right, Melissa. If I win in November, and I'm doing everything I possibly can to win that election, then this Senate term will be up in 2020, and I will need to run again. And this is how I approach this. First of all, I am just working as hard as I possibly can work. In the time since I've been in the Senate, we have done over 100 meetings and roundtables and conversations with Minnesotans all over the state. That's just on the official side. That doesn't count on the campaign side. We've had conversations with people and gotten people's ideas on everything from child care to the Farm Bill to veterans, what are the issues for veterans and immigration issues. And I will continue that. I really believe that my job is to listen really hard to Minnesotans, to take what they have told me and then to be their voice in Washington, D.C., and then to fight like hell to get things done for people in Minnesota. It's hard sometimes when you look at the way things are in Washington. It's easy to get sort of down in the dumps about it and feel like it's hard to make progress. But there are opportunities to get things done every single day. It might be something that affects only 1 or 2 people, but that is so important. Just last week, I heard a story about how our staff in our St. Paul office was able to help an individual who has DACA status to be able to move towards becoming a citizen. Now, that is a hugely important thing for that guy and his family. And I see those individual opportunities to do good as really, really important, especially right now when it's so hard to make big headway on the big issues that are facing our country.
Laura asks, this is not for me, a different Laura asks, Richard Painter has used some pretty harsh language linking you to Trump and corruption, such as allegations about investments related to Polymet and Glencore. And you might want to elaborate what Glencore is since we haven't mentioned yet. What would you say in response to Richard Painter about this?
Well, for an ethics lawyer, Richard Painter often plays pretty fast and loose with the facts. He has misrepresented my record in a variety of ways, particularly with what he said about my support for the Twin Metals mine, which is not true. He's been out telling people that I'm in favor of destroying the Boundary Waters, which is not true. I'm just going to stop with that. I am really focused on talking to Minnesotans about what issues are on their minds and not getting too distracted by this sort of back and forth and political tit for tat. But I want people who are watching this today to know that I am not afraid to stand up to this president when I believe he is doing things that are bad for our country. And I have consistently done that. I have, for example, I called on the resignation of Scott Pruitt because I believe that the way in which he's used public service for private gain was unworthy of our government, and now he's resigned. I have not supported Gina Haspel or Pompeo, the president's nominees to run our international, our foreign affairs. I have strongly stood up to the president on issues related to immigration, which are ripping our country apart. I've introduced legislation to stop the Trump administration from doing the things that they're doing to separate children from their parents. I have been a fighter when it comes to the things that this president is doing that I think are counter to our democracy, and I will continue to do that.
Karen asks, do you plan to do public debates on the issues with others running against you in the primary? And she's just curious because she thinks it'd be helpful to hear your position side by side with your opponents or other people running. So
Well, we have a debate next in 2 weeks.
Okay.
There will be a debate, sort of a debate forum at FarmFest, and that is something that is kind of tradition in I think it will be me and Professor Painter, and Karin Housley will also be there, and I believe there's another person who's running on the Republican primary who will be there. And so I look forward to that discussion, and I think it'll be really important on issues that affect rural Minnesota and the rural economy.
Great. We'll have to get the details on
Yes.
FarmFest and put them up on our page.
I think it'll be, we'll make sure that you guys get
Okay,
that.
fantastic.
And I think it'll also be, I'm sure there'll be lots of ways for people to watch it and listen to it on the radio, and so we'll make sure that everyone gets a hold of that.
Fantastic. Mary says, I know you've proposed a bill to address the situation of children who have been separated from their parents at the border, and the conditions in the detention centers at the border, which are atrocious. Do you have plans to visit any of these facilities?
Yes, I am very eager to go down and visit, and I have introduced, I want to talk about two pieces of legislation that would improve, several pieces of legislation that would dramatically improve what's happening. The way in which the Trump administration has used harming children as a way of changing the behavior of adults is just so awful. And I think there's been an outsurge of worry and anger about this. I'm supporting bills put forth by Senator Feinstein in California to halt this practice immediately. Now it has halted, but now the next thing is we need to get children and their parents reunited. And I have also co-sponsored legislation that would demand that the administration give us information and immediately reunite parents and children. An issue, though, that a lot of people are less aware of, but I'm very deeply aware of, is what's happening between parents and children in the interior of our country. It is not only parents and children on the border. A bill that I've introduced called the HELP Act would give parents at least some basic ability to watch out for the well-being of their children if they are detained in the interior. We discovered this was an issue when we heard the story about this a mom who was detained by immigration enforcement, and her child and her toddler and I think it was like a 7-year-old had to take care of one another by themselves for several days until a relative could come and help them. And that is just ridiculous. So my bill would make sure that at least parents could make sure that their children were taken care of. And I'm strongly opposed to expanding detention facilities. Also, I think that is completely the wrong direction for us to go.
The proposed one in Pine Island, you would not support?
I do not support that. I do not support that. I worry that the more detention beds we have, the more people will become detained, and that is, this is going in completely the wrong direction, particularly at a time when people are active and contributing members of our community, and we need them.
Chuck has a clarification question about the environmental review that you mentioned. Is that being done? You said it was being done by a state body, not the Trump administration, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
The environmental review for mines in Minnesota is led by the state DNR and also by the Pollution Control Agency. There are, over 20 different permits and environmental review, each permit with its own specific review process, and those are state permitting requirements.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Vanessa asks about your views on gun violence and common sense regulations and what you have done so far and what you plan to do in the Senate on this really important issue.
On the issue of gun violence, I think that kids have been such a strong moral voice on this issue, and I think we should all listen to them really carefully. I support common sense reforms that would keep guns out of the hands of criminals and dangerous people. And you know what? I think something like last data I saw, something like 90% of Minnesotans would agree with these kinds of common sense provisions. Like there shouldn't be a loophole that allows you to, there shouldn't be a loophole for gun purchases if you buy them online, for example. So I strongly support that. I also think that we need to repeal this ridiculous rule that says that we can't do research on gun violence as a public health issue, which exists right now. I would repeal that. I would also go back to laws that we used to have. We used to have laws in this country in the 90s that put restrictions on military-style high-capacity guns with high-capacity magazines that are designed to kill a lot of people all at once. We used to have those restrictions in this in this country, and I think that we could go back to them while still protecting people's rights.
Melissa asks if you support legalizing marijuana, both recreational and then like an expanded medicinal use beyond what's currently legal in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah. So I think this is an issue that is really changing rapidly. It reminds me a lot of the change in public perceptions around marriage. And we can see right now that states all over many states are moving forward. So I think we have this kind of crazy, mismatch or kind of hodgepodge of rules between state laws and federal laws where marijuana is still on the controlled substance list. I think that local law enforcement should be able to should be focusing on public safety issues and violent crime issues much more than, and I think that their need to do enforcement on pot it makes it a lot harder for them. I haven't yet signed on to any particular legislation about legalizing or at the federal level, but I'm looking really hard at that, and I'd love to know what everybody else, I'm gathering lots of information to see what people think. Let me just say one other thing about this, because it's really, when you look at how enforcement around pot, how the disparities in enforcement between white people and people of color and poor people, it is really a terrible thing, and is, I think, another good reason why I think this issue is
So you support decriminalization for sure, it sounds like.
So what I'm saying is that I haven't taken a position yet on decriminalization, but I'm really worried about, but as you can see, I'm signaling that that I think there's I think we're moving in that direction.
Sounds like everyone needs to let Tina Smith know what they think of that issue. So, Autumn asks, what can you do about the affordable housing and rental crisis in Minnesota? I know that's a huge. I know it really varies depending on like municipality, but in general, what would you do about that issue?
It is a huge issue, and it's a basic economic development issue. We have companies and organizations that can't find the people that they need in order to grow. And why is that? Well, it links back to housing. There's not places for people to live. It's an issue all over the state. It's especially an issue in rural Minnesota. And so I think that we need to support the federal and state programs that help to build affordable housing, not repeal those proposals like Trump has repealed them, or how he hasn't supported the funding for them. Again, I would really suggest that people take a look at my Republican opponent, who says that she gives Donald Trump an A on the work that he does, and I presume that includes affordable housing. So I support the strong work of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency to build more affordable housing units. I've introduced a bill with my colleague from New Hampshire that would make sure that we keep rental vouchers in place, especially in rural areas, because that's to help make rental housing more affordable. And I support the basic federal strategies like the Community Development Block Grants, which helps to fund affordable housing, and also the work at Housing and Urban Development. The big problem we have is that the cost of building an affordable or a workforce housing unit costs more than the amount that people can afford to pay. Could I also just say that if people were in jobs that were paying more money, this would also, I think, help to solve this problem. The big problem we have is that incomes are stagnating. They have been stagnant for many years, while the incomes of big companies continued, and people in the top 1% continue to go up, and that's kind of the underlying inequity that we have to resolve.
That was the perfect transition into our next question from Karen. How do you plan to support public schools and collective bargaining for teachers and other workers?
let me just,
big question.
I know, I'm trying to break it apart a little bit, but that's good. So let me just first talk about collective bargaining. I am a strong supporter of collective bargaining and the rights of people to come together and collectively organize for better working conditions, for higher wages. I am very, very proud to have the support of teachers and of the AFL-CIO, and have the strong labor support as I go into this Senate campaign. And I'm deeply worried. This is why this election is so important. I'm deeply worried about the attempts of the Trump administration to roll back those protections. And we see it also on the Supreme Court, another example of why the Supreme Court is so important. So I am fighting against all of those, and it's why I hope that people will vote for me in November. My opponent, again, on the Republican side, gives Donald Trump an A when it comes to issues. Supporting education is the second part of this question, and education is the engine of opportunity for everybody. But unfortunately, the opportunity to have a great education is not available everywhere and to everyone. When I was lieutenant governor, I'm really proud of the work that we did to provide more funding for education, especially for all-day kindergarten that is now free for everybody in this state. 99-point-something% of all kindergarten-age kids now can go to all-day kindergarten because of the work that Governor Dayton and I did. Also, I'm really proud of the work we did to expand early learning opportunities and preschool for kids. That's sort of at the beginning end is really important. I just introduced a bill a couple of weeks ago, I think, that is going to make it, that supports people in teaching. Here we have a situation, I've talked to teachers, especially in early childhood education, who are working really, really hard, and they're practically at the poverty level because the salaries are so low. So my bill will make it easier for teachers to get the training and the mentoring and help easier for teachers and districts to do that kind of training and mentoring to help get more teachers into the profession.
What's the name or the file number for that bill if people want to take a look at it?
Well, we'll have to get. I'm like, I can never remember.
Yeah, I know that
all the names of all the bills, but I would love to get people's support for that bill.
Okay.
We just introduced it a week or so ago, and we're working hard to get sponsors and to get a hearing on it.
We have a lot of teachers and stand-ups, so I'm sure they'll be really excited to hear about that. We actually have another question about education. So the crippling student debt crisis in this country. How can you help those trying to advance their education but also keep it affordable and not have them, drowning in debt because they just want to make their lives better? Yeah,
it is a huge issue, and I've been working really closely with Elizabeth Warren on this issue. Senator Warren has been a real strong supporter for college affordability and making it and also for standing up against what I think are really predatory practices by a lot of the student loan organizations that are not giving students the information that they need about what's going to happen with their loans. I think on Thursday I was talking with Secretary DeVos about this terrible practice that's been happening where people have loans and they have grants, and those grants get transformed into loans without their knowledge because of some stupid paperwork challenge. And I'm calling on the Department of Education to fight that as well. So I'm working really hard on this issue, and I hope everybody else will get involved in this as well.
So our time is just about up. I want to thank you so much, Tina, for joining Stand Up Minnesota for this town hall, and thank you all on the live stream for your questions. We hope you're enjoying our series of town halls. The recording of this town hall will be available shortly for viewing in the group and also on the YouTube channel for further sharing. We'll be announcing additional town halls shortly, so stay tuned. Tina, is there any topics? I mean, I'm sure there are topics we didn't get to that you want to talk about, but is there anything you want to leave our viewers with?
Well, I want to leave everybody with this. Your voices are strong, but only if you use them. And so I'm asking all of you and all of us to be strong as we go into this election. It is of vital importance that we all use our voices and we speak out for the issues that we care about. Those might be local issues that matter a lot to your local community, or they could be the big issues at the national level that are shaping the future of our democracy. So thank you so much for using your voices and for being strong, and I really look forward to working with all of you.
Thank you.